Time to get out your broadsword and flagon of ale, cause it's time to rank the albums of Amon Amarth. Alright, and let's start right from the beginning with Once Sent from the Golden Hall in 1998. Now, I love this debut, and if you've skipped over the band's early work, you're missing out on some of their best stuff, in my opinion. It's just so much more aggressive than anything from even their most popular albums, just really bringing that hellfire fitting to the album cover. Plenty of banger tracks here like Ride for Vengeance, Friends of the Sun Cross, Without Fear, Abandoned, and the slower, self-referential Amon Amarth. It also features Martin Lopez of Opeth and Soen on drums. Not their best, but high up there for me. I'm putting it at A tier. Next up, The Avenger in 1998, and I think this takes everything that I already loved about that debut and just steps it up. They were still very aggressive at this point with that raw 90s production that sounds like everything is just burning around you, very fast, just balls to the wall kind of music. Bleed for the Ancient Gods is a great album opener, and then that crazy vocal intro for Metal Wrath gets me so fucking amped every time. God, His Son, and the Holy Horror bring some really infectious tremolo melodies. Great album, maybe even a little underrated. Easily my favorite of their early work, and actually in my top 3 of the entire discography. This is going to S tier. They followed that up with The Crusher in 2001, and of the earlier albums, this is easily my least favorite, and by a pretty wide margin. The songwriting just isn't as engaging, the production feels off, the pacing is clunky, and it's just missing some of that special sauce. This also feels very transitional, with the slower moments teasing the direction of the next album. Lots of second-rate forgettable material here, save for a few decent bangers like Bastards of a Lying Breed, Releasing Surtur's Fire, and especially The Sound of Eight Hooves, which is easily the best track. Not awful, but not one I go back to much. Putting this one at C tier. Definitely for the best that they changed their sound a bit after this one because it was getting a little bit tired. Which brings us to Versus the World in 2002. So this is where Amon Amarth really started to shift into the style that they're most familiar for, with the mid-paced head-bobbing grooves and more emphasis on the melodic riffing. I have an interesting relationship with this one because I really respect it and recognize that it's actually some people's favorite album from them, but all the same, I find it to be a little bit dull.
How dare you!
Death and Fire is definitely the highlight for me, with those pounding, almost tribal-sounding drums and instantly recognizable driving riffs. Speaking of which, I do wish that the production was a little bit better because the drumming is great, but it sounds a little bit clicky in the mix. Even so, I think that the atmosphere is great, especially for little touches like the church bell in the intro of For the Stab Wounds in Our Backs. Across the Rainbow Bridge is solid as well. Johan called this their darkest, heaviest, and most melancholic album, and there's probably some truth to that. But I also find myself personally bored with how slow and repetitive some of these tracks get, like Where Silent Gods Stand Guard. It turns into almost a drone after a while, especially in the second half. I'd honestly compare a lot of this more to listening to something like Moonspell. Now, I am going to move this one up a little from last time because they have far worse ones, and I think this album, perhaps more than any other, represents more of an issue of personal taste, really. But it still falls into the lower half of the discography for me. Consider it like my favorite of my least favorite Amon Amarth albums. It's going to B tier. Then we had Fate of Norns in 2004, another album that just does very little for me. I know people who, again, love these albums, but to me, when I think Viking metal, the last thing I think is plotting and slow, which is a lot of the approach here. To its credit, the melodies are pretty great at crafting the atmosphere on tracks like An Ancient Sign of the Coming Storm. The title track is also relatively solid, as are The Pursuit of Vikings and Fate of Norns, with those extremely earworm main hooks. But then you have the dull and drawn out Where Death Seemed to Dwell in its sleepy guitars and spoken word. Valkyrie's Ride feels very half-baked to me, and I pretty much completely check out for the last two tracks. On top of that, I've always felt like the production on this album is also a bit weaker than the others, to the point that it's kind of bothersome to my ears. Not terrible by any stretch, but just painfully average. Another one going to C tier. But then we get With Oden on Our Side in 2006. Huge album and a fan favorite for sure. It was also their first to enter the Billboard charts. They said they were going more back to their roots with this one, and I think that tracks, as pretty much every song is a banger. Valhalla Awaits Me kicks off with that super hype marching riff before taking off into the triumphant tremolo melody. Asator is a total rager that never fails to get me banging my head no matter the context. Gods of War Arise has a fun bounce that always gets me bobbing along. The title track feels totally epic. Cry of the Black Birds has some very memorable riffing and mournful atmosphere. And I love the windswept vibes of Under the Northern Star. Always my go-to album when people ask where to start with this discography. It's really a no-brainer for me. Going to S tier. And then, as if that wasn't enough, they followed that up with Twilight of the Thunder God in 2008. Another fan favorite. I actually forgot that this and With Oden on Our Side were back-to-back. Several notable guest appearances here too, including entombed vocalist Lars Goran Petrov, Children of Bodom and stone guitarist Rup Latvala, and Finnish band Apocalypta. I apologize as always for the mispronunciations. Possibly one of their best album openers of all time in the title track, and easy to see how this one took off between the killer riffs and highly infectious chorus that just begs for audience participation. Although to be fair, it is kind of a Valhalla Awaits Me Part 2. More fun, bouncy riffs on Guardians of Asgard and Varyags of Miklagard. Tattered Banners and Bloody Flags is another fantastic War March track to get you hyped for battle, or at least for the gym. Kind of feels like a better version of the formula from Versus the World. The Hero has a touch of Dark Tranquility sprinkled in there, and then Live for the Kill is just one of those Amon Amarth tracks that will always be popular live, and another great choice to throw on for a new listener. Love those strings at the end too. Arguably them at the peak of their abilities. Another one going to S tier. Then we got Surtur Rising in 2011, so people I talk to seem to either love or hate this album, and personally, I tend to think that it's mad underrated. This album goes hard, right from the start with War of the Gods, mixing their more melodic modern touches with the brutality of their early work. Lots of dark atmosphere, and the vocals in particular get extra deathy on this one. Just deep and guttural and brutal, and I fucking love it. Destroyer of the Universe lives up to its name, bringing raging, scorching hellfire. Great hook on Slaves of Fear. Live Without Regrets is downright triumphant, and I love the touches of strings again alongside the moody melodies on Doom Over Dead Men, one of my favorite slower songs from the band overall. And A Beast Am I may be one of their heaviest songs to date. Total banger. Y'all haters missing out. Give it another listen if it's been a while, because seriously, it's awesome. It's going to A tier for me. Then there's Deceiver of the Gods in 2013. Some don't care for this album, and I admit a lot of it feels like a retread at this point, but it's the formula still done really well in my opinion. The opening title track still gets my head banging, and the main tapping hook on As Loki Falls is totally sick. Blood Eagle is more than sufficiently aggressive. Coming of the Tide is a real foot tapper with more fun riffs and a wicked solo. Really, the whole album goes pretty hard. Lots of fun dueling harmonies, and Friedrich giving a great final performance on the drums. I also dig the ex-Candlemass singer Messiah Markolin's inclusion on Hell to break things out of the mold for a rare moment. Not one of their best, but a rock-solid album and very consistent listen. I'm putting it at B tier. Alright, moving into the modern era with Jomsviking in 2016. So when this came out, this was one of my biggest disappointments of that year. I know a lot of people seem to really enjoy this one, but I find it to be pretty boring overall. That said, I will say that on this recent re-listen, I didn't hate it, and that may be in part to listening to Berserker right before it, and this at least sounding way better than that by comparison, so more on that later. First Kill has grown on me a bit, and some of the harmonized riffs are kind of fun. The production's also pretty solid compared to Where We Go From Here. On a Sea of Blood and One Against All are decent. The chanting on Raise Your Horns is pretty fun, as are the bluesy hooks on Vengeance Is My Name. At Dawn's First Light has a banger intro riff with the chugs, just wish it wasn't interrupted by the goofy spoken word. Easily my favorite on the album, very Death Clock. So I'm still not in love with it and pretty average overall in the scope of things, but it's earned enough cred, and again, compared to some of the other albums on here, it got bumped up a little bit from last time. Consider it sort of like a C plus B minus on this list. So then, as I referenced, we have the Berserker in 2019, and sadly, it just gets worse. I also really disliked this album when it came out, but I still dislike it just as much as I did back then. Fafner's Gold is like a tease with the acoustic intro before it kicks into flat, poorly produced guitar work that is about as exciting as a wet fart, if you ask me.
Oh god, how embarrassing.
It doesn't sound like Vikings epically storming some ancient land, it just sounds like a bunch of bearded dudes in the studio. Crack the Sky and Shield Wall are equally uninteresting, and the video is just laughable for that one. It seems like the shtick has kind of run its course with the riffs and songwriting, and that could be said for pretty much the entire album. It's just a faded photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, robbed of all of its fun and intensity at this point. Giving some credit, Valkyria, Raven's Flight, Skull and Hati, and Wings of Eagles are decent. Like, it's far from terrible, and especially if you're newer to the band, I could see why you might enjoy it, but as a long-time listener, I just get nothing out of it beyond wanting to go listen to the better albums. And with a cover and title like Berserker, I expect a lot more bloodlust. I mean, even the title track is pretty damn boring, so this one is my least favorite overall at D tier. And that brings us to the newest edition, the Great Heathen Army in 2022. So obviously I didn't have high hopes for this one, and another bad start here with the first single, Get in the Ring, which I think one of the commenters put it best on my reaction video to this one, describing it as like a really bad WWE walkout music. And honestly, this track is so boring that I don't know who is going to use it as a hype track. The Great Heathen Army is slightly better, especially with its accompanying D&D themed music video, but it's still not enough for it to really make an impact. Hydrant should be a fun track with its folky swing, but it feels like such a generic and uninspired version of something I've heard done so much better by the likes of Equilibrium and Svartsat. It doesn't even sound like they're having fun. Oden Owns You All is the first song that at least got me banging my head a little with its more overtly brutal death metal energy, especially in the final third or so where they kick into that groovy start-stop riff. But really it's not until Find a Way or Make One that this album really seems to start in with its better material. Digging the atmosphere and call and respond vocal sections on this one, it feels much more in line with something off of Deceiver of the Gods. Same goes for Dawn of the Norsemen and Skagul Rides With Me with their triumphant driving melodies and harmonized soloing. It's still not even close to their best material, but at least it has some of that old charm to it. But if you want my personal favorites here, the first is Saxons and Vikings, which not only has the one real absolute banger hook on the album, it's also actually a unique addition thanks to quite literally members of Saxon. And then the Serpent's Trail, despite some unnecessary spoken word sections, has some pretty rad symphonic elements I'd be interested in hearing more of. So all said and done, this is like half of a good album that takes way too long to get started, and I feel like by the time you do get into the best material, it's over. I still can't fully put it to words what exactly is missing, but at least a few of these tracks still bring back some of that old magic. So ultimately, I'm going to split the difference on this one and put it at a low C tier. Y'all check out this playlist for more melodic death metal tier lists, and let me know down in the comments what you think of these rankings. Where do you agree? Where do we disagree? But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.